Ole Miss could have the absolute best wide receiver in the country in Tre Harris, but that doesn't change the fact that the addition of Juice Wells and Deion Smith coming means they'll likely also have the best wide receiver room in the country. We'll explain.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi, I'm Stephen Willis, a former staff member at Ole Miss and a 10-year veteran member of the national media with Yahoo Sports. Also did a little bit of time at WSMV in Nashville. Thank you very much for tuning in on this Thursday. Today on the show, we talk about the addition of Juice Wells and why the wide receiver room is going from good to great. We look at the backups in that room and their potential relationships with Austin Simmons and Walker Howard and what that means. And also, what does Deion Smith bring on top of everything? We discuss all of this stuff in this pre-spring position room breakdown day. This is the Locked On Ole Miss podcast, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're free and available on all the podcast apps and on YouTube. Thanks again for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen every day, and a special hello to the everydayers that make everything possible. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. New customers can join today and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So, Ole Miss with Tre Harris has potentially the best wide receiver in the country. You can probably debate it. I don't know if you can debate it very much because of what Tre Harris can do and what he did in the equivalent of about 75% of the season last year. Jaxson Dart had an amazing year. He turned a corner in year two at Ole Miss, 233, 358, 3,364 yards, 23 touchdowns, 5 receptions. Also, he developed a relationship with each of his wide receivers. They went out to California. They threw. You could tell there was almost a psychic connection between him and Jordan Watkins and Tre Harris and Dayton Wade during the course of the season. Now, Jordan Watkins and Tre Harris will be coming back this season, but the player that is interesting is Juice Wells, Antwane Wells, who transferred from South Carolina. This is his 2022 numbers. He had 68 catches, 928 yards, and 6 touchdowns. A really good wide receiver, and that's important because catch-wise, Ole Miss is actually losing their leading receiver from a year ago. Not their best receiver, but just catch-wise, he caught the largest number of balls by 1. I think Ole Miss had a leading receiver of 55 catches, a second leading receiver of 54, and a third receiver of 53 catches as well. It was incredibly balanced, and Ole Miss had 3 receivers over 700 yards, none under 1,000, none over 1,000. Tre Harris was the closest to it. He was like 15 yards away. But Antwane Wells, he provides a little bit more than Dayton Wade did. Now, Dayton Wade is a good receiver. Don't hear this as me complaining about Dayton Wade. But Antwane Wells, Juice Wells, provides a higher ceiling version of Dayton Wade that will take a little bit of the pressure off of Tre Harris, who, like I said, is probably the best wide receiver in the country. And Jordan Watkins, who is the Mr. Reliable of this offense, they're going to only improve by the addition of Juice Wells, who was assumed to be a probable spring starter this spring. And when you look at these 3 basic wide receivers, there are basically 2 things that need to be done. Juice Wells needs to establish a connection with Jaxson Dart. And we'll see if Jaxson Dart is healthy after his pre-spring surgery. We'll see exactly how that looks as well. Nothing necessarily to worry about, but that connection is an important thing. We'll see how that looks, and we'll see how it affects Tre Harris and Jordan Watkins going into the spring, having him on the other side of the field, and with the addition coming of Deion Smith and Marquise Willis, which we're going to talk about in the third segment, you can see that there's a need for you to establish yourself during spring to get ready for basically a fall season that could be for the ages with Ole Miss fans. Juice Wells provides a little bit of that plus Dayton Wade thing. Now, when you look at the other wide receivers that are probable starters, you have Tre Harris, who had 54 catches, 985 yards, and 8 touchdowns. And like I said, about 70% of the season. He got injured on the first drive in the second game of the season against Tulane. He was out the next game entirely. He played a couple of snaps against Alabama, but he wasn't quite anywhere near where he needed to be. And then he was back the following week against LSU and put up massive numbers. So it was essentially 3 games. 3 out of the 12 games, he was essentially out. He played very little, probably less than 10 snaps in the Tulane game, probably less than 10 snaps in the Alabama game. And he still put up these numbers. With a full season, you can add a third to this, essentially, because a third of the season, a third of the 9 games would be basically going into the games he missed. You'd have a situation to where 12 catches, 300 yards, 4 touchdowns, something like that. And 64, 65, 66 catches, 1,300 yards, 12 touchdowns. That's absolutely possible off the year that Tre Harris had last season. He got a little bit nicked up against that Tulane game, and I hate that it affected everything because I think with a healthy Tre Harris, Ole Miss beats Alabama. I honestly believe that. I think that just enough of the playmakers got hurt going into Alabama. There was no Caden Priestcorn, who was one of the better run blockers on the offensive line. Tre Harris was extremely limited. It was basically Dayton Wade and Jordan Watkins, 2 little guys, 2 pseudo slot receivers that were being asked to beat Alabama. Now, if you look at Jordan Watkins, he had 53 catches, 741 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Again, missing about a third of the season. Well, not necessarily missing it, but just not being effective because he had a broken hand. And you can imagine how a broken hand would affect a wide receiver. This is all what we're talking about. This wide receiver room is absolutely stacked. These are the starters, presumably, going into spring football. This will be what we're watching, these 3 players. But these are probably not the only storylines that you have to deal with going to spring. We're going to talk about the backups going in. And the backups are important. The backups are probably more important than you know going into spring practice this year. And it's not Kedrick Risano important, but it's important for these backup wide receivers because those guys get work with Austin Simmons and Walker Howard. And we are about 12 months away from a quarterback competition at Ole Miss that I don't think Ole Miss fans are ready for. That relationship between these backup receivers and the quarterback is going to go a long way to determine the starter in 2025. But we'll talk about that in the next segment. Right now, these Juice Wells, I think he's a plus version of Dayton Wade. Okay? A plus version of Dayton Wade. Dayton Wade was a terrific wide receiver. He made some crazy circus catches and all of that stuff. I think Juice Wells can add even a little bit more than what Dayton Wade was able to do. And you have, like I said, Deion Smith and Marquise Willis coming in May. You have these backups. Ayden Williams has a chance to take a step. We'll see what happens. This is a very important spring for the wide receiver position and how they could be. Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen of the day. We're just getting started. The starters are pretty set for spring, okay? But Noreel White, Ayden Williams, and Cayden Lee also have important springs as well. And it isn't quite why you think. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with a winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, same game parlays, exclusive props of your favorite games and teams and like that. And they have much, much more at FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and Shoot Your Shot. FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every single league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 stream channel. All right, in the first segment, we talked about the wide receiver position and the starters, which placed this wide receiver unit in a class by itself. Now let's talk a little bit about the backups that get to kind of sit back, and the importance for these three wide receivers isn't necessarily for the 2024 season. And I get with the transfer portal, you can't necessarily play the program game, but it still is an important season if they want to stay. The three players that really stand out, we got Noreel White, and we have highlights of Noreel White. And this is a good wide receiver that he is tailor-made to be a slot type wide receiver. And I can see a lot of what Ole Miss had in 2023 with Jordan Watkins, Dayton Wade, and Tre Harris, with Ayden Williams, Cayden Lee, and Noreel White. There's a lot of similarities there. When you look at Noreel White, he is tailor-made as a slot type wide receiver, much like Cayden Lee is. And these guys can be very explosive. Now, in high school, Noreel White played mainly on the outside. That's because their offenses aren't sophisticated like they are in college football, and they don't have the time to do it. There are certain situations in Mississippi high school football where if you have a really good athlete, he plays a certain position. Noreel White even played some quarterback his junior year. He is a really good football player. He was a commit to Arkansas for a large portion of his recruitment. He changed over to Ole Miss, and you have a nice little wide receiver core in the pipeline, stocked up and ready to go, of Ayden Williams, of Cayden Lee, and Noreel White. Now let's talk Cayden Lee. Cayden Lee I think he's out of Georgia. He's a slot receiver. Brian Smith, the Locked On recruiting analyst, absolutely loved this guy when he signed. He signed late during signing day, if I remember correctly. And he's a guy that he said would show up at like 7-on-7 in the camp thing, and you would look at him and you would immediately discount him. If you look at Cayden Lee's numbers in recruitment, he was a 3-star player. And a lot of it's because of his size and the way he looks. He looks like somebody you underestimate. He does. But once the pads go on, once he starts playing the game, he becomes essentially an alpha dog and uncoverable. And if you want any proof of that, Jordan Watkins was injured for the Peach Bowl. Could not play in the Peach Bowl. Cayden Lee, a true freshman that has hardly played, up into that game, he had 2 catches for 2 touchdowns, and that was it. He played next to none. He goes into the Peach Bowl, and he's basically uncoverable. Plays a very solid game, does all the things you would want a slot receiver to do. He showed that he was ready, probably more so than any receiver on the roster, to take the next step. I think he is a hands-down backup slot wide receiver going into 2024. I think he's going to see the field a little bit. I think because of Cayden Lee, Deion Smith and Marquise Willis, they're probably slated to be outside type wide receivers. I think Cayden Lee has done a lot of stuff really well and has turned some heads. And because of that, him and Noreel White, there's an interesting little situation building at slot receiver and kind of like that secondary slot type stuff. There's a lot of stuff that Ole Miss does with, it might be 11 personnel, 1 back and 1 tight end, but it's shaped up to where there's 4 wide receivers out in the route, with a tight end being one of them. And because of that, sometimes the tight end and the outside receiver, which is Tre Harris, becomes the outside wide receivers, and you kind of play with a dual slot receiver. And you can see that potentially happening, I should say, in 2025 with Noreel White and Cayden Lee. Two really good wide receivers, two that are basically tailor-made for the slot wide receiver position. The last receiver I want to talk about out of this group is Ayden Williams. Ayden Williams was the star of fall camp. He played a little bit against Mercer. He played a little bit against Tulane, had a bust. And the one thing that they do not have any patience on the staff for missed assignments. There is no OJT with this team. That's what practice is for. Get out in the game. You're supposed to make plays. Ayden Williams had a bust on a route, and you didn't hardly see him that much the rest of the year. You saw him a couple of times. There was a couple of package-type plays where they brought Ayden Williams in and let him try to attack down the middle of the field or something like that. But overall, his playing time diminished significantly. And he's a true freshman. He's going to swim. This is going to happen. He still has all the talent in the world, and he's better than every receiver that was in this 2024 recruiting class. Ayden Williams has a chance to be an unbelievably special player. He has a chance to be Tre Harris, if we're just going to be honest about it. But all three of these wide receivers, they're not going to get a ton of playing time this year. They're not. Ole Miss just isn't going to start playing a bunch of players. It's like everybody says, well, maybe they'll rotate on the offensive line a little more. They're not. Maybe they'll rotate on the wide receiver room a little more. They're not. They're going to do the same thing they've done for the last 4 years. We have enough of a sample size right now to know exactly how this is going to handle. So backup wide receivers are probably not going to play that much. So why would I say that spring practice is so important for this group, specifically of three players? And that is because 12 months from now, Austin Simmons and Walker Howard are going to undertake the greatest quarterback competition in the history of Ole Miss football. And a large say of who wins that quarterback competition will determine the relationship of these wide receivers with the quarterback that wins. That relationship is going to go such a long way in determining who the quarterback after Jaxson Dart is going to be. And I have thoughts about that race as well. I think, a couple of days ago, I talked about Walker Howard and Austin Simmons and how Austin Simmons is probably the most talented quarterback that Ole Miss has ever signed, even over Manning's unbelievably talented, even over Matt Corral. You have a situation right now. Austin Simmons is somewhere around 6'3", 6'4", I believe. He's like Tua with 3 or 4 more inches. He is somebody that is constantly working at his craft. Listen, I've heard different stories of what's going on, but the chance is Austin Simmons is not going to miss that much, if any, of spring practice in football, which is important for a quarterback. I talked about earlier in the week that Austin Simmons having a role in the baseball team would be detrimental. That doesn't seem to be the case after, what I heard over the last couple of days. Austin Simmons playing quarterback, Austin Simmons pitching, not playing in the field, not hitting. It's kind of easy to go over there and do your pitching workout, 30, 45 minutes, you're good to go. But Austin Simmons going through spring practice with the rapport that he is building with his wide receivers. I've heard stories all over the place that Austin Simmons goes and gets his wide receivers, takes them to the IPF, and they throw. He is already ringleading doing that. Like I said, Jaxson Dart's the dude. He's the man. But for a freshman, 18 years old, to be taking this much of a step, like I said, it's early in the process. We're 12 months away from even having that conversation. But Austin Simmons, in my opinion, might have a leg up to be the quarterback after Jaxson Dart. We'll see. The debut of the Grove Bowl, everybody should check out the Grove Bowl. I know it's on TV now, so it hurts attendance and all stuff like that. But that's going to be Ole Miss Nation's introduction to Austin Simmons. Absolutely massive game just because of that. Everybody remembers Jaxson Dart's spring game and how bad that was. Everybody, that was the first impression onto the scene. And Jaxson Dart is still, believe it or not, he still has trouble getting over that spring game performance because of that first impression that was made. Austin Simmons gets a chance to announce himself in the middle of baseball season. He might play in the spring game and then go play in a baseball game, depending on when the week is. I've heard rumors that spring practice is not going to happen until after spring break, to where they can do everything all together, which if that happens, that puts the spring game, if there is a spring game, somewhere near May 1st, somewhere near the end of the semester. So we'll see exactly how that goes. I'm pretty fired up about this backup wide receiver group and what it means for next season. I always talk all the time that we don't do programs anymore. Nobody does programs anymore, but you kind of can compartmentalize do programs a little bit. And that is a chance where these three wide receivers have a chance to be the dude next year. And it all starts with this spring and stuff like that. Pretty cool indeed. So still more to come on Locked On Ole Miss, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Deion Smith and Marquise Willis are due at Ole Miss in May. How does the wide receiver room get reshaped with these talented prospects coming in? We'll tell you in just a second. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, all views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. See the view from your seat before you buy so you know exactly what to expect before you arrive. All-in prices show your total up front so you know you're getting a great deal before you check out. Buy tickets with 2 taps. Click, click, you're done. They're obsessed with finding ways to help save you money on tickets. And they have tickets right up to the start of the event and even an hour after it starts. It's the place to find last-minute seats, obviously. Find exclusive flash deals and sponsored deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more, and with zone deals. This is really cool. You just pick the section, and Game Time picks the seats for big-time savings. And the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section in a row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Terms apply. Just download the Game Time app. Use code LOCKEDON, all one word, for $20 off your first purchase. Again, use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thanks for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen of the day, and shout out to the everydayers. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows that cover every single league. For your second listen, go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 stream channel. Be part of history. Now, there's a little bit of a wrinkle, and we always, in these previews, we talk about who's coming. Well, in May, 2 players are coming that are supremely talented in Deion Smith and Marquise Willis. When you look at Deion Smith, Randy Moss level talent, and a story, honestly, similar to what Randy Moss went through trying to get into college. For young bucks that don't know what's going on, Randy Moss originally signed with Notre Dame. Either got kicked out or flunked out of school, something like that. Went to Florida State, got kicked off that team as well, ended up at Marshall and then the Hall of Fame. That's pretty much how that went. But Deion Smith started at LSU, wanted to transfer out, did not quite have the grades to do it. Ended up going to East Mississippi Community College, ended up transferring from there to Holmes County Community College. From there, transferred to Ole Miss. This is a really good football player. Now, Holmes, God bless him, their offense has been fairly simplistic from what I've seen on film. You see him running a lot of goes. You see him running a lot of seams, and you see him running crossers. And these are all routes that are designed to show his athleticism. These are things that are done because of how good he is. And Holmes County is really good at doing that. But what you notice is supreme athleticism, huge catch radius, and his run after the catch skills are amazing. He returns punts. He does everything for that school because he honestly should do everything for that school. You have a situation with Deion Smith that he could come in and take Juice Wells' position by the fall. By the end of fall, he could be making a case for getting on the field more and more. Now, we talked last segment. Ole Miss does not switch a lot of players at wide receiver. They do not play a lot of guys there. Juice Wells or Deion Smith could become an either-or type situation. Tre Harris and Marquise Willis could become an either-or type situation. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. This competition in the spring, since this is a pre-spring look at the wide receiver room, it's going to be on Juice Wells. It's going to be on Tre Harris. It's going to be on Jordan Watkins. And all the backups that want to get that little bit of extra playing time, it's going to be on them to create enough separation that they can't be caught in fall camp, because fall camp's coming. Now, Deion Smith is going to be swimming a little bit. This is the first time he's seen that. And he's seen SEC level players because he played at LSU, but it's the first time that in a while he's seen it. He has had the athletic ability to be the superior, best athlete on the field for the better part of the last 2 years. Marquise Willis, whenever you look at video of him, same thing. He ended up having to play quarterback some at the junior college level because it's just a situation that he's the best athlete on the field. These two players are going to raise the level even a little bit more of the wide receiver room. Juice Wells, Tre Harris, and Jordan Watkins, they might be the best triumvirate of wide receivers in the entire country. Those getting added to by Deion Smith, Marquise Willis, and these young guys, Ayden Williams, Cayden Lee, and Noreel White, and you have a wide receiver room that has a chance to be potentially the most special that Ole Miss has had in my lifetime. And I say that a lot. This is the best in my lifetime. This is the best in my lifetime, because right now, Ole Miss football is the best in my lifetime. And a lot of that comes from talent and what's going on. The Grove Collective, the whole 9 yards, they do a pretty fantastic job. This wide receiver unit has very little time, I guess, to go from good to elite. And they have the talent. There's talent all over the field. But you know what the coaches say, your talent's going to get me fired. Your potential is going to get me fired. The potential needs to be realized, and that is the important step that Ole Miss needs to stick on. It's why Lane Kiffin does the rat poison thing every time one of these articles come out. It's why he does that. It's like a playful thing. They don't want people to take that within the walls and rest on their laurels. That's what it is. And Ole Miss is better than they've ever been. I think it should be natural that people could be a little bit, wary of being ranked this high, but they should embrace it. They should own it. They are better than they've been in at least the last 47 years. So we'll see exactly how it goes for Ole Miss in 2024. Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first and listen every day. Everydayers will have Derek Vandegrift. He comes back later today talking about the Hawaii series this weekend and why basketball is needing to bounce back as we wait on the most anticipated football season ever at Ole Miss. You can hear it all here. We're going to talk about that Hawaii season. Apparently, Austin Simmons, who we talked about, in Hawaii, he traveled. And if he traveled, he's probably going to get to throw. So that's just my gut there as well. But for your second listen, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows that cover every single league. For your second listen, go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube. Subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 stream channel. For all of those of you on YouTube, we'll send you there right now. Hotty toddy, everyone.